A stranger walked into his apartment with a smile and her old key. What she was hiding behind the walls would change both their lives forever. It was around 8:30 in the evening when everything changed. The kind of quiet Tuesday night where nothing special happens, you know? Just another regular day winding down. Our guy had been sitting at his small desk for the past 3 hours, hunched over his laptop with his headphones on, completely lost in his work. He was a graphic designer, 28 years old, and he'd just moved into this studio apartment about 2 weeks ago. The place wasn't fancy or anything. Just a simple one-room setup with a tiny kitchen corner, a bathroom that had seen better days, and a window that looked out onto the building across the street. But it was his. His first place living completely alone. No roommates, no shared spaces, no drama. Just peace and quiet to work on his freelance projects and finally have some space to breathe. He'd spent the last 2 weeks slowly making the place feel like home. A few posters on the walls, his plants lined up on the windowsill, books stacked in the corner because he still hadn't bought a bookshelf. The usual stuff. He was still getting used to the sounds of the building, the way the pipes made that weird groaning noise at night, how the neighbor upstairs always seemed to drop something heavy around 7 in the morning. That evening, he was working on a logo design for a new coffee shop downtown. The client was picky, kept changing their mind about colors and fonts, and the deadline was approaching fast. So there he was, headphones blasting some focus music, eyes glued to the screen, fingers moving across the trackpad as he adjusted curves and tried different layouts. He was so deep in concentration that he didn't hear the first click of the door lock, didn't hear the handle turn slowly, didn't notice anything at all until he caught movement in his peripheral vision. Someone was walking into his apartment, not knocking, not calling out, just walking in like they owned the place. His heart jumped into his throat. For a split second, his brain couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. He yanked off his headphones so fast that they clattered onto the desk. The music kept playing faintly from the speakers, some instrumental jazz that now felt completely out of place. A woman stood in his apartment. Mid-30s maybe. She was wearing a long coat and carrying a canvas grocery bag in one hand. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and she had this calm expression on her face like she was just coming home after running errands. But this wasn't her home. This was his apartment. His locked apartment. Or at least he thought he'd locked it. Had he forgotten? No, he always locked it. Always. He was paranoid about that kind of thing, especially being new to the building. The woman didn't stop or apologize. She just kept walking, heading straight toward the kitchen area like she knew exactly where she was going. She set her grocery bag down on the small counter, and that's when she seemed to actually notice him sitting there, staring at her with his mouth hanging open. She turned around and looked right at him. And then she smiled. Not a nervous smile or an embarrassed smile. It was warm, almost friendly, like she was greeting someone she knew. "Oh," she said, her voice casual and light. "You're still here? Still here?" What did that even mean? He felt like he'd been dropped into the middle of someone else's conversation. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this a prank? Was he being recorded? Was she dangerous? Should he be scared? He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out at first. He cleared his throat and tried again. Who are you?" His voice came out higher than normal, shaky. "What are you doing in my apartment?" The woman tilted her head slightly, and for the first time, a flicker of something crossed her face. Maybe realization. Maybe regret. She took a small breath and spoke calmly. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you. My name is Margaret." She said it like giving her name would somehow make this whole situation normal. "I used to live here. In this apartment. I lived here for 3 years, actually, until last month." He blinked at her, trying to absorb this information. The previous tenant. Okay, that explained. Well, it explained why she seemed to know the layout, but it didn't explain why she was here now, walking in like she still had every right to be here. "I still have my key," she continued, pulling a key ring from her coat pocket and holding it up as if to prove her point. "I know I should have given it back to Mr. Chen, the landlord. I meant to. She trailed off, looking down at the key in her hand. "I needed to come back. Just for a few minutes. I left something here. Something important, and I need to find it." He stood up from his chair, his legs feeling a bit unsteady. His phone was on the desk behind him. He could reach it in one quick motion if he needed to. He wasn't sure if he needed to. Margaret didn't seem threatening exactly. She wasn't yelling or acting aggressive. But this whole situation was bizarre. Who just walks into someone else's home? You can't just walk in here, he said, trying to sound firm but not aggressive. This is my place now. You need to leave. Margaret nodded quickly. I know. You're absolutely right. I'm so sorry. I really am. But please, I just need 5 minutes. Maybe 10 at the most. I left something here that I can't replace, and I've been thinking about it for weeks. I didn't know how else to get it back. The landlord wouldn't have understood if I'd asked him. There was something in her voice now, something that cut through his initial shock and fear. She sounded desperate. Not dangerous desperate, but sad desperate. The kind of desperation that comes from losing something precious. He looked at her more carefully now. Her coat was nice but worn at the edges. Her shoes were practical, a bit scuffed. The grocery bag on the counter had the logo of the discount market 2 blocks away. And now that he really looked at her face, he could see she looked tired. Not just physically tired, but the kind of tired that settles into your bones when life has been hard for too long. Still, letting a stranger stay in his apartment to search for something, that went against every common sense rule he'd ever learned. His mom would have been horrified if she knew. His friends would call him crazy, but something stopped him from immediately calling the police or forcing her out. Maybe it was the way she was looking at him, like she was holding on to hope by a thread. Maybe it was because he'd been in tough spots before and knew how it felt when you desperately needed something and had nowhere to turn. 5 minutes, he heard himself say. That's it, and I'm staying right here the whole time. What are you looking for? Relief washed over Margaret's face so visibly that he felt his chest tighten. She clasped her hands together briefly, almost like a silent thank you. It's a small wooden box, she said quickly. About this big. She held her hands up to show a box roughly the size of a hardcover book. I hid it before I left because I didn't want it to get lost in the move. I was going to come back for it, but things happened so fast and then I was too afraid to ask and… She was talking faster now, words tumbling out. I think I put it behind the radiator or maybe in the closet somewhere out of sight. He crossed his arms, watching as she moved toward the closet. His heart was still beating faster than normal, and he kept his phone in his pocket, finger ready to hit the emergency call if needed. But as Margaret began carefully searching, moving aside his jackets and looking behind the boxes he'd stored on the shelf, he started to realize this woman wasn't a threat. She was just someone who'd lost something important and was trying to find it again. And somehow, on this quiet Tuesday evening, she'd walked back into what used to be her home, smiled at a stranger, and asked for a chance. Margaret moved quickly once he gave her permission, like she was afraid he might change his mind. She went straight to the closet, pulling the sliding door open with a familiarity that reminded him this really had been her home not long ago. He watched from a few feet away, arms still crossed, trying to decide if he was being incredibly kind or incredibly stupid right now. She pushed aside his winter jackets, the ones he'd just hung up last weekend, and started feeling along the back wall of the closet. Her hands moved systematically, checking every corner, every shelf. He could see her hands were shaking a little. Not a lot, but enough that he noticed. It made him wonder just how nervous she really was, despite that calm smile she'd given him earlier. Why didn't you just ask the landlord? He found himself saying. The question came out before he could stop it. He wasn't trying to be mean, but it seemed like the obvious solution. Mr. Chen seems like a reasonable guy. I'm sure he would have let you come get your stuff with him present or something. Margaret paused her searching for a moment. She didn't turn around to look at him, just kept her eyes on the closet as she spoke. Mr. Chen is a good man. He really is. But he wouldn't understand this. He'd asked too many questions, want to know why it was so important, probably want to see what was in the box. Her voice got quieter. Some things are private. Some things you can't explain to people because they won't get it unless they've lived through it. There was something heavy in the way she said that. He found his curiosity growing despite himself. What could be so important that she'd risk coming back here like this? What was in this box that she couldn't just let go? The radiator, Margaret said suddenly, moving away from the closet. I think I might have put it near the radiator. She crossed the small apartment to the old cast-iron radiator under the window. It was one of those ancient ones that clanked and hissed when the heat came on. He'd almost asked the landlord about replacing it, but decided it had a certain charm. Margaret knelt down beside it, her coat spreading out around her on the floor. She started feeling along the back of it in that narrow space between the radiator and the wall. "When did you leave?" he asked, moving a bit closer but still keeping his distance. "Mr. Chen said the apartment had been empty for a few weeks before I moved in." "About 3 months ago," Margaret said, her voice strained as she reached further behind the radiator. "I had to leave pretty fast. Couldn't afford the rent anymore and things were complicated." She pulled her arm back out empty-handed and sat back on her heels with a frustrated sigh. "I packed up in about 2 days. My friend helped me move the big stuff. Everything was so chaotic. I forgot about the box until about a week later, and by then I was too embarrassed to come back." "Too proud, maybe?" He understood pride. He understood how hard it could be to admit you'd messed up or needed help. He'd been there himself, back when he'd lost his job 2 years ago and had to move back in with his mom for 6 months. The shame of that had been crushing, even though his mom had been nothing but supportive. Margaret stood up and looked around the apartment with a kind of sadness in her eyes. "I lived here for 3 years, she said softly. 3 whole years. I know every inch of this place. That crack in the ceiling above where you have your desk, I used to stare at that when I couldn't sleep. The window sticks a little when you try to open it. You have to push up and to the left at the same time." She was right about the window. He'd figured that out the hard way on his 3rd day here. "The bathroom," Margaret said suddenly, her eyes lighting up with a new thought. "There's a loose piece of baseboard in the bathroom, behind the door near the floor. I remember now. That's where I put it." She moved toward the bathroom and he followed, feeling less anxious now but still alert. The bathroom was tiny, barely enough room for a toilet, sink, and a narrow shower. Margaret squeezed in and knelt down behind the door, running her fingers along the white-painted baseboard. "Here," she whispered. Her fingers found a section that looked slightly different from the rest. She pressed on it gently and it moved. It wasn't installed properly, just sitting in place. She carefully pulled it away from the wall, and there in the small dark space behind it was a wooden box. The change in Margaret's face was immediate and dramatic. All that tension that had been holding her together seemed to release at once. Her shoulders dropped, her mouth opened in a small gasp of relief, and her eyes filled with tears. She reached in with trembling hands and pulled out the box, holding it against her chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Oh, thank God," she breathed. "Thank God, thank God, thank God." The tears started falling then, quiet and steady. She wasn't sobbing or making a scene, but the tears just kept coming as she held that box. He stood there in the doorway of the bathroom, not sure what to do or say. This felt like such a private moment, but he was part of it now whether he wanted to be or not. "Are you okay?" he asked awkwardly. It was a dumb question. Obviously she wasn't okay. People who are okay don't break into their old apartments looking for hidden boxes. Margaret nodded, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. I'm sorry, I thought it was gone. I thought I'd lost it forever." She looked up at him, her eyes red but her face showing something like joy. "You don't know what this means to me. You can't possibly know. What is it?" The question came out gentler than he'd intended. He was genuinely curious now, all his earlier fear and defensiveness fading away. Margaret looked down at the box in her hands. It was old, the wood dark and worn smooth from handling. She hesitated, clearly debating whether to show him. They were strangers after all. She'd invaded his home. She didn't owe him any explanations, but then she slowly opened the lid. Just a little at first, peeking inside herself like she needed to confirm the contents were really there. Then she opened it wider and tilted it so he could see. Inside were photographs. Old ones, the kind printed on actual photo paper, not just images on a phone. They were stacked carefully, edges worn from being looked at many times. On top was a photo of a little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. Beneath the photos he could see letters, folded carefully and tied together with a faded pink ribbon, and nestled in the corner was a small gold locket tarnished with age. "My daughter," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "These are the only pictures I have of her. The only physical ones. Everything else got lost or taken, but I kept these safe, or I thought I did until I realized I'd left them here." The air in the small bathroom felt heavy suddenly. He didn't know what to say. What could you say to something like that? He thought about his own mom, how she had boxes of his childhood photos stored carefully in her closet. He'd always thought it was a bit silly, how she insisted on printing photos when everything was digital now. But looking at Margaret holding this box like a lifeline, he understood. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's get out of this tiny bathroom. I'll get you some water or something." Margaret nodded and stood up slowly, clutching the box to her chest. They moved back into the main room, and he went to the kitchen area to fill a glass with water. His hands were shaking a little now too, he realized. The adrenaline from earlier was wearing off, leaving him feeling drained and oddly emotional. When he turned around, Margaret had sat down on the floor, her back against the wall, the box in her lap. She looked exhausted, like she'd been carrying a huge weight and had finally been able to set it down. She looked vulnerable in a way that made him feel protective rather than threatened. He handed her the water and sat down on the floor too, a respectable distance away, his back against the opposite wall. They sat there in silence for a moment, two strangers in an apartment that meant different things to each of them. And somehow, in that strange, quiet moment, everything shifted. This wasn't an intruder in his home anymore. This was just another person, struggling and hurting, who'd found something she thought she'd lost forever. They sat there on the floor for a few minutes, neither of them speaking. Margaret sipped the water slowly, her other hand never leaving the wooden box in her lap. He could see her thumb moving back and forth across the lid, a soothing motion like she was reassuring herself it was really there. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was heavy with unspoken things. Finally, Margaret took a deep breath and looked over at him. "I owe you an explanation," she said. "After everything, after just walking in here like I did, you deserve to know why." He shook his head. "You don't have to explain anything. It's your business." "No, I want to." She set the water glass down beside her and adjusted how she was sitting, getting more comfortable, like she was settling in for a longer conversation. 5 years ago, I lost custody of my daughter. Her name is Sophie. She's 13 now, and I haven't seen her in person in over a year. The words hung in the air between them. He felt his chest tighten with sympathy. He'd heard stories like this before, seen them in movies and on TV. But hearing it from someone sitting right in front of you was completely different. It was real and raw and painful. "Her father and I got divorced when she was 7, Margaret continued, her voice steady but quiet. "It wasn't a good marriage. We fought a lot, wanted different things. The divorce itself wasn't even that bitter at first. We agreed to share custody week on and week off. It was working okay for a while." She paused, looking down at the box again. "But then he got a new job, a really good one at some tech company. Suddenly he had money. Real money. A nice house, a new car, all of it. And I was still struggling, working 2 jobs just to keep my head above water. When Sophie stayed with him, she had her own room with new furniture, all the latest gadgets, private school. When she stayed with me, we were in a cramped apartment, eating budget meals, making do with what we had. He could see where this was going, and his heart sank for her. "He used that against you," he said quietly. Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening again. "He got a better lawyer than I could afford. Started documenting everything, every little mistake I made. The time Sophie was late to school because my car broke down. The time she didn't have her soccer uniform because I couldn't afford to wash clothes at the laundromat that week. He made it look like I was neglectful, like I couldn't provide for her properly. That's not fair, he said, feeling anger rise up on her behalf. Being poor doesn't make you a bad parent. Try telling that to a judge, Margaret said with a bitter little laugh. The court ruled in his favor. He got full custody. I got supervised visitation once a month. 1 day a month with my own daughter. And someone watching us the whole time like I was dangerous. Her voice cracked. Do you know what that feels like? To have your own child look at you like you're a stranger? To know you're missing everything? Her birthdays, her school plays, her first day of middle school, all of it? He didn't know what to say. What could anyone say to that? His own childhood hadn't been perfect, but at least his mom had always been there. Even when things were tough, even when they were living on ramen and canned soup, she'd been there. My mom raised me alone, he found himself saying. My dad left when I was 6, just walked out one day and never came back. We struggled a lot. There were times when Mom worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on, but she never gave up. He looked at Margaret. You remind me of her. That determination to hold on to what matters. Margaret's expression softened. What happened to you? Did you stay with your mom? Yeah. She got me through high school, helped me get into community college for design. It wasn't easy, but we made it work. He smiled slightly. She still calls me twice a week to make sure I'm eating vegetables and not just ordering takeout. That got a small laugh from Margaret, a real one. It changed her whole face, made her look younger and less worn down. That sounds nice. Having that connection. It is, he agreed. Then carefully he asked, what happened with this apartment? Why did you have to leave? Margaret sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping. I lost my job. I was working as an administrative assistant at a medical office. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady. Then the office merged with a bigger practice, and they let half of us go. I tried to find something else, I really did. But around here, jobs aren't easy to come by, especially when you don't have a college degree. She gestured around the small apartment. This place, as small as it is, was eating up more than half of what I made on unemployment. I couldn't keep up. I fell behind on rent, and Mr. Chen was patient for a while, but eventually I had to go. A friend from work let me crash on her couch while I tried to figure things out. And that's when you forgot the box, he said, understanding now. Everything happened so fast, Margaret explained. I was packing, stressed out of my mind, trying to coordinate the move with my friend's schedule. I had this idea that I'd hide my most important things, the stuff I absolutely couldn't lose, and then come back for them once I got settled somewhere else. I thought I'd have more time, but once I was out, I was too ashamed to come back and ask, too proud to admit I'd made such a stupid mistake. She picked up the box again, holding it gently. These photos, these letters, they're from when Sophie was little, before everything fell apart, before the divorce, before the custody battle, before she started looking at me like I was disappointing her. These are memories of when I was still just mom to her, when I was her whole world and she was mine. He felt a lump forming in his throat. He thought about his own mom's boxes of photos, how she'd pull them out sometimes and tell him stories about when he was little. He'd always rolled his eyes a bit, thought it was silly nostalgia. But maybe it wasn't silly at all. Maybe those memories were lifelines, proof that there were good times even when things got hard. That smile, he said suddenly, remembering how Margaret had first looked at him when she walked in. When you first came in, you smiled at me like everything was normal. I couldn't figure that out. I thought maybe you were crazy or something. Margaret actually laughed at that, a fuller sound this time. I probably looked crazy. I felt crazy. She shook her head. I stood outside this building for almost 2 hours before I worked up the courage to come in. I must have walked around the block 10 times. I kept thinking about what I'd say if someone was here, how I'd explain it. And, he prompted. And I realized that if I came in looking scared or desperate, if I seemed threatening in any way, whoever was here would call the police before I could even explain. I'd be arrested for breaking and entering, and I'd never see this box again. She looked at him directly. So I decided to smile, to act calm and friendly like I had every right to be here. I thought if I seemed confident and non-threatening, maybe, just maybe, I'd get a few minutes to look. That's actually pretty smart, he admitted. Terrifying for me, but smart. I'm sorry I scared you, Margaret said sincerely. I really am. I was just so desperate to get these back. They're all I have left of the good times. All I have to remind me that I was a good mom once, that Sophie and I were happy together. He looked at the box sitting in her lap, at the way she held it like it contained the most valuable treasure in the world. And maybe it did. Not valuable in money, but in meaning, in memory and love and loss. Can I ask you something? He said after a moment. Sure. Why did you hide them at all? Why not just pack them with your other stuff? Margaret was quiet for a moment, thinking. Honestly, I think part of me was afraid. Afraid that if I packed them in boxes with everything else, they'd get damaged or lost in the chaos. Or maybe... She trailed off, then continued softly. Maybe I was afraid that leaving them here meant I'd have a reason to come back. Like as long as they were here, I wasn't completely gone from this place. Does that make sense? It did make sense in a strange way. Sometimes people held on to things not because they were practical, but because letting go felt too final. Too much like giving up. Do you want to look at them? He asked gently. The photos, I mean. You came all this way. Margaret looked surprised by the offer, then grateful. Would that be okay? I know I've already taken up so much of your time. It's fine, he said, and he meant it. His work deadline suddenly didn't seem so important anymore. This felt more significant somehow. Being here for this moment with this person who'd just been a stranger 20 minutes ago. Margaret carefully opened the wooden box and began taking out the photographs one by one. Her hands were steadier now, more reverent, like she was handling sacred objects. The first photo she showed him was of a tiny baby wrapped in a pink blanket, eyes closed, one little fist raised near her face. This was the day she was born, Margaret said softly, a smile playing at her lips despite the tears in her eyes. September 14th. It was a Tuesday, 3 a.m, longest labor of my life, but the moment I saw her, everything else just disappeared. He looked at the photo, at the pure innocence captured there. She's beautiful, he said, because what else do you say? Margaret nodded, setting that photo gently aside and picking up another. This one showed a toddler with wild curly hair, covered head to toe in what looked like spaghetti sauce, grinning at the camera with pure joy. This was her second birthday. She decided to wear her dinner instead of eating it. I was so frustrated at the time, but now, she laughed quietly. Now I'd give anything to clean up that mess again. They went through several more photos like that. Sophie at 3 years old in a princess costume. Sophie missing her front teeth, holding up a certificate from kindergarten. Sophie in a soccer uniform, muddy and proud. Each photo came with a story, a memory that Margaret shared like she was afraid of forgetting them if she didn't speak them out loud. After about 20 minutes, Margaret carefully placed all the photos back in the box, along with the letters and the locket. She closed the lid slowly like she was reluctant to put them away even though she knew she had to. "Thank you," she said, looking at him with genuine gratitude. "Thank you for letting me have this. For not calling the police, for not throwing me out immediately. You didn't have to be kind, but you were." He felt embarrassed by her thanks, unsure how to respond. "I didn't really do anything. I just didn't make things worse, I guess." "That's more than most people would do," Margaret said. She stood up slowly, brushing off her coat. "I should go. I've taken up enough of your evening already. You probably have work to do." He stood up too, glancing at his laptop on the desk where his unfinished project was still waiting. It felt like that was from another lifetime now, even though it had only been maybe an hour since Margaret had walked through his door. "Wait," he said as she moved toward the door. She turned back and he saw her tense slightly, maybe worried he'd changed his mind about letting her leave with the box. "Your key. You should probably leave it with me so I can give it back to Mr. Chen, or you could drop it off with him yourself." Margaret reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the key ring. She looked at it for a moment, that same sadness crossing her face. Then she carefully removed one key from the ring and held it out to him. "This one's to the building entrance," she said. "I should keep that one since I have friends who still live here. But this one," she removed another key. "This is to this apartment." "You're right. I should have given it back a long time ago." He took the key from her hand. It was warm from being in her pocket, and it felt heavier than a key should feel, weighted with meaning. "I'll make sure Mr. Chen gets it. Thank you." Margaret adjusted the box under her arm, securing it like she was never going to let it out of her sight again. "You seem like a good person. I'm really glad it's someone like you living here now. Someone who understands, you know?" "I'm trying to," he said honestly. Margaret smiled at him one more time, and this time he understood that smile completely. It wasn't just politeness or an act to keep him calm. It was gratitude, relief, and a kind of peace that came from finding something precious that you thought was lost forever. Then she opened the door and walked out into the hallway. He stood in the doorway and watched her head toward the stairs, the wooden box held carefully against her chest. She didn't look back, just kept walking until she turned the corner and disappeared from view. He closed the door slowly and locked it, then stood there for a minute trying to process everything that had just happened. His heart was still beating a little fast, and his apartment felt different somehow. Quieter, emptier, like the space Margaret had occupied for that short time had left an echo behind. He walked over to his desk and sat down, looking at his laptop screen. The logo design was still there, half-finished, waiting for him, but he couldn't focus on it. His mind kept replaying the evening. Margaret's face when she found the box, the photos of little Sophie, the stories of a life that had fallen apart piece by piece. After sitting there uselessly for about 10 minutes, he gave up on work. Instead, he picked up his phone and called his mom. She answered on the third ring, sounding happy and a little surprised to hear from him on a weeknight. "Hey, honey, everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah, Mom, everything's fine. He paused, not sure how to explain. "I just wanted to call and say thanks for everything you did when I was growing up, for not giving up even when things were hard." There was a moment of silence on the other end. Then his mom's voice came back warmer and a bit emotional. Where's this coming from? I don't know. Just thinking about stuff. He looked around his small apartment. Did you ever worry that you weren't doing enough? When it was just you and me and things were tough? His mom sighed. Every single day. I worried I couldn't give you what other kids had, that you'd resent me for the struggles. But I did my best with what I had. That's all any parent can do. They talked for another half hour about nothing and everything. When he finally hung up, he felt better, more grounded. He made himself some instant noodles for dinner and tried to work on his project again, but his heart wasn't in it. He kept thinking about Margaret, wondering if she'd made it home safely, hoping she was somewhere right now looking at those photos and remembering better times. The next morning, he woke up thinking about what had happened. Part of him wondered if he'd dreamed the whole thing. It had been so surreal. But then he saw Margaret's apartment key sitting on his desk where he'd left it, and he knew it had all been real. He decided to stop by the landlord's office before work. Mr. Chen was there, as always, sitting at his cluttered desk with papers everywhere and a cup of coffee that looked like it had been forgotten hours ago. Morning, Mr. Chen said, looking up with a friendly smile. Everything okay with the apartment? Yeah, everything's fine. He held up the key. Actually, I wanted to give this back to you. Margaret, the woman who lived there before me, she stopped by last night. She still had her key and wanted to pick up something she'd left behind. Mr. Chen's eyebrows rose in surprise. Margaret came back? How is she? She seemed okay. A little stressed, but okay. He set the key on the desk. She said to return this to you. She apologized for not giving it back sooner. Mr. Chen picked up the key, turning it over in his fingers. He was quiet for a moment, a sad expression on his face. Margaret was a good tenant. Always paid on time until she lost her job. I felt terrible when she had to leave, but I run a business, you know? I can't keep a unit empty just because someone's going through hard times. I understand, he said, because he did. Everyone had their own struggles, their own limitations. Her ex-husband, Mr. Chen continued, shaking his head. That man made her life difficult. He used his money and connections to make things harder for her. Got her blacklisted from some jobs around here, or at least that's what I heard through the community. Some people use their power in cruel ways. That information hit him hard. He'd suspected the ex-husband was difficult, but hearing that he'd actively worked to keep Margaret down made him angry. What kind of person did that, especially to the mother of their child? Is there anything that can be done? He asked. To help her, I mean? Mr. Chen shrugged sadly. Not much. These kinds of situations, they're complicated. Family courts, money, lawyers, it's all beyond what regular people like us can fix. He looked up at him. But you did a good thing letting her get whatever she needed. That's something. Sometimes the small kindnesses matter more than we think. He left the landlord's office feeling unsettled. He went to work, sat through meetings, worked on his designs, but his mind kept drifting back to Margaret and Sophie. To a daughter who was growing up without her mother, and a mother who was living without her daughter. The unfairness of it gnawed at him. Over the next few days, he found himself thinking about the encounter constantly. He'd look at his apartment differently now, seeing it not just as his space but as a place where someone else had lived a whole life, where Margaret had laughed and cried, had cooked meals and gone to sleep at night, had hidden a box of precious memories hoping to keep them safe. He wondered if everyone's home held stories like that. If every apartment, every house, every room had layers of lives lived within its walls. The thought was both comforting and sad. We all leave traces behind, whether we mean to or not. 3 months passed. Fall turned into winter, and the city took on that gray, cold quality that made everyone walk a little faster and keep their heads down. He'd settled into his apartment more completely now, added more furniture, hung more pictures on the walls. The place felt like his, though sometimes late at night, he'd still think about Margaret and wonder how she was doing. He'd tried to find her on social media a few times, but Margaret was apparently a common enough name, and without knowing her last name or having any other details, it felt like looking for a needle in a haystack. Eventually, he stopped searching, though he never stopped thinking about that evening. It had changed something in him, made him more aware of the struggles people carried invisibly, the stories hiding behind every face you passed on the street. It was a Saturday afternoon in late January when he saw her again. He'd been working from home all week and desperately needed to get out of the apartment. So he grabbed his laptop and headed to his favorite coffee shop 3 blocks away. It was one of those independently owned places with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. The kind of spot where you could sit for hours and nobody bothered you. He ordered his usual black coffee and a muffin, then found a table near the window. That's when he saw her through the glass. Margaret was sitting at a corner table inside, working on a laptop of her own, completely focused on whatever was on her screen. She looked different, better. Her hair was styled nicely and she was wearing what looked like professional clothes, a nice sweater and a scarf. There was something about her posture too, less defeated, more present. His first instinct was to leave her alone. Why bring up what must have been an embarrassing moment for her? She probably didn't want to be reminded of that night, of breaking into her old apartment in desperation. But something made him hesitate. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the fact that he'd spent 3 months wondering about her and here she was, right in front of him. Before he could talk himself out of it, he walked over to her table. She was so focused on her screen that she didn't notice him at first. He cleared his throat softly. "Margaret?" She looked up and for a second, there was no recognition in her eyes. Then it hit her. Her face went through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, embarrassment, uncertainty, and then, finally, something like warmth. "Oh my God," she said, half standing from her chair. I didn't expect to see you here." "I come here a lot," he said, feeling awkward now. "I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to say hi, see how you're doing." Margaret gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Do you want to sit? I mean, if you have time. I'd understand if you don't want to after everything." He sat down, setting his coffee on the table. Up close, he could see that she really did look better. There was color in her cheeks and her eyes didn't have that hollow, desperate look they'd had that night. She looked like someone who was sleeping better, eating regularly, living instead of just surviving. "You look good," he said honestly. "Like things are going better." Margaret smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "They are. A lot better, actually. I got a job about 6 weeks ago. Nothing fancy. Just bookkeeping for a small nonprofit downtown. But it's steady work and the people are nice. The pay's not amazing, but it's enough." "That's great," he said, genuinely happy for her. "I'm really glad to hear that. I'm living in a small apartment on the south side now. It's tiny, smaller than that studio you're in, but it's mine. Well, rented, but you know what I mean." She laughed a little. "It feels good to have my own space again, to not be crashing on someone's couch." They talked for a few minutes about surface things, the weather, the coffee shop, the neighborhood. But he could tell there was something she wanted to say, something bigger that she was working up to. Finally, she took a breath and just came out with it. "I need to tell you something," Margaret said, her voice getting more serious. "About Sophie. About my daughter." He leaned forward slightly, paying attention. "She reached out to me," Margaret continued, and her whole face changed when she said it. She looked younger, lighter, like someone had lifted a weight off her shoulders. "About 2 months ago. She found me on social media. Her father doesn't know, or at least he didn't at first." "That's amazing," he said, feeling a surge of happiness for her. Margaret nodded, and he could see tears starting to form in her eyes, but they were good tears this time. "We've been video chatting. Not every day, because she has to be careful, but a few times a week. She's 13 now, and she's so smart, so funny. She looks so much like me at that age, it's almost scary." She pulled out her phone and showed him a recent photo. It was a screenshot from a video call, showing Margaret on one side of the screen and a teenage girl on the other. The girl had Margaret's eyes and smile, and she was making a silly face at the camera while Margaret laughed. "She's beautiful," he said, and meant it. "The best part," Margaret said, putting her phone away, "is that she doesn't hate me. I was so afraid that her father had turned her against me completely, that she'd grown up thinking I abandoned her. But she's old enough now to ask questions, to want to know my side of the story. We're rebuilding something. It's slow and it's complicated, but it's happening." "How did it start?" he asked. "Her reaching out, I mean." Margaret's expression became more thoughtful. "Remember that box? The one I came to get?" He nodded. How could he forget? "I wrote her a letter," Margaret explained. "Using the photos from the box, I put together a letter with pictures of us when she was little. Stories about things we did together. Memories I wanted her to know about. I sent it through her school counselor, someone I knew from the parent-teacher conferences years ago. I didn't know if it would reach her or if she'd even read it if it did. She paused, wiping at her eyes with a napkin. But she read it. She told me later that she'd been feeling confused about everything. About why I wasn't around, about the stories her father told her. The letter gave her another perspective. It made her want to know more, to hear from me directly. "So that box," he said slowly, understanding dawning. "Getting it back, it really did change everything. If I hadn't found it that night, I don't know if I would have had the courage to write that letter," Margaret admitted. "Those photos, those memories, they reminded me of who I was before everything fell apart. They reminded me that I was a good mother once, that Sophie and I had something real and beautiful. Without them, I think I might have just given up completely." They sat in silence for a moment, letting that sink in. He thought about that night, about how close he'd come to calling the police immediately, to forcing Margaret out before she could explain. What would have happened then? Would she have found another way? Or would she have lost hope entirely? "I never properly thanked you," Margaret said quietly. "For not calling the police. For giving me those few minutes. For treating me like a person instead of a criminal. You didn't have to do that." "You weren't a criminal," he said firmly. "You were just someone trying to get back something that belonged to you." Still, a lot of people wouldn't have seen it that way. Margaret looked at him intently. "I've thought about that night a lot over these past few months. About how one moment of kindness from a stranger completely changed the direction of my life. If you'd reacted differently, I wouldn't have gotten the box. I wouldn't have written the letter. Sophie and I wouldn't be talking now." He felt uncomfortable with the weight of her gratitude, like he'd done something heroic when really he'd just been decent. "I didn't do anything special. I just didn't make things worse." "That's more than you think," Margaret said. "In a world where people usually choose the safe option, the option that protects themselves first, you chose to trust me. To give me a chance. That matters more than you know." They talked for another hour after that, the conversation flowing easier now. Margaret told him more about Sophie, about the things they talked about during their video calls, about the careful dance of rebuilding trust with a teenager who'd been taught not to trust her. She talked about her new job, her new apartment, her plans for the future. For the first time in years, she said, she actually had plans that felt possible. He told her about his work, about the projects he'd been doing, about his mom and how their relationship had gotten even stronger after his call that night. He didn't tell Margaret that she was the reason for that call, but maybe she suspected. When they finally said goodbye, Margaret hugged him. It was quick and a bit awkward, but genuine. "Thank you," she said one more time. "For everything. For being exactly who you are." He watched her leave the coffee shop, walking out into the cold January afternoon with her head held high and a smile on her face. She looked like someone who'd found her way back from a dark place. Someone who'd been given a second chance and was determined not to waste it. Walking home later, he thought about how strange life was. How one random Tuesday evening, a woman had walked into his apartment like it was her own and just smiled. How that bizarre, uncomfortable encounter had turned into something meaningful. How you never really knew which moments would matter, which small decisions would ripple out into bigger consequences. He thought about all the times he'd chosen the easy path,